matters that flow from it. So until Pakistan has sufficient laws to guarantee the security of the democratic process, then there will always be problems. That also depends on one other thing, that the judiciary are totally independent to enforce those laws. So firstly, Pakistan should have the laws to protect human rights abuses, including strong electoral laws. And the judiciary should be independent of any interference from any other source. What the EU could then do, as I said, the mistake they made in 2002, and I will keep repeating it, there is no point sending missions, there is no point having great support for human rights acting from within the heart of the EU Commission unless you enforce them. I was annoyed that it didn't happen in 2002. Another place I was deeply involved in was monitoring Hong Kong when it was handed back to China. Okay? I was the rapporteur for that from 1997 to 2004. I supported the agreement when Hong Kong was handed back to China, that there would be a protection of the rule of law and limited democracy initially, and then full democracy, but that human rights would be protected. China, in recent years, absolutely destroyed the one country, two system. And what exists in Hong Kong now is a system which operates in mainland China. The EU did little. All it was interested in was trading relationship with Hong Kong, and once again it sacrificed human rights for its trading interests. And one thing that I wonder, in my view, China's primary objective is not to be the world's, at this point, major military power. I believe its objective is to be the world's economic power. And I think the EU should have employed massive economic and financial sanctions on China, which threaten its ability to become the world's economic power. And by the way, let me just finish one point. I wonder if they had have done that, would Putin have invaded Ukraine? I think Putin, when he saw China getting away with it, decided he would get away with it. And I think the failure for the EU to take strong action gives encouragement to dictators like Putin and elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. Last question, please. Read the question.
देखिए यहाँ एक पीछे जो जनरेटर चल रहा है उसकी वजह से जी बेटी
Sir, should I repeat the question? Sir, he's basically asking कि legislation करते हुए कोई और remedy instead of going to the courts, हम कोई और remedy कैसे remedy during legislation?
देखिए जो हमारा इलेक्शन एक्ट 2017 है उसके अंदर एक पूरा चैप्टर है सज़ाओं का, और वो सज़ाएँ बहुत सख्त सज़ाएँ हैं किसी भी मिसकंडक्ट के ऊपर। लेकिन 2018 के इलेक्शन में हमने देखा कि फ़ौज ने इलेक्शन एजेंटों को उठा के और पोलिंग स्टेशनों के बाहर फेंक दिया, और 78,471 जो फॉर्म 45 थे which were displayed at the website of the Election Commission of Pakistan, only 128 had valid signatures of polling agents. Now, in this condition, some remedies have to be found out. इस दफ़ा जो हम कर रहे थे और हमने जो प्रपोज किया था वो ये था कि तमाम कैंडिडेट्स का एक व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप बन जाए, और वो व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप जिस वक्त आप फॉर्म 45 भेजते हैं रिटर्निंग ऑफिसर को, उसी वक्त वो व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप के अंदर आप तमाम कैंडिडेट्स को भी भेजते हैं। ये व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप जो है आप वैसे भी कैंडिडेट्स को हिदायत देने के लिए, गाइडेंस के लिए आप इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं। वो जो है कि जनाब हमने एक नया सॉफ्टवेयर बनाया है, अ सॉफ्टवेयर विच डायरेक्टली टॉक्स टू द सैटेलाइट्स फॉर दोज एरियाज विच आर नॉट डोंट हैव द सर्विस ऑफ इंटरनेट। अब इस किस्म की जो बातें हैं वो, लेकिन ये कि हम ये तीन चीज़ें जो मैंने अर्ज की, एक तो पोस्टल बैलेट, एक यूनिफॉर्म क्राइटेरिया फॉर क्वालिफिकेशन एंड डिस्क्वालिफिकेशन, and the third thing, making WhatsApp groups of candidates in every constituency and transmitting the results of polling stations directly to those candidates. मेरे ख्याल से थोड़ी बहुत रुकावट पड़ेगी, लेकिन बस चाहते हैं सो आप करें, हमको बस बनना।
बहुत शुक्रिया साहब। इस बात की जो आज का वक्त है हुआ है, तो मैं This comes
saying what an honor it is to be here and to commend the kingdom for the path that you are clearly on. And start with a note of optimism because I am an optimist. In addition to the AI revolution, which has already been mentioned, this is a phenomenal time for business and frankly for the state of humanity. The biotech revolution, the potential of the energy transition to reinvent the way that we obtain our energy. There are so many different revolutions happening at the same time. And there are perhaps early signs of some benefit from that. So, as an example, productivity growth in the United States over the past couple of years has started to pick up. It's too early to know whether that's related to these opportunities, but it's certainly possible. But to harness the benefit of those revolutions and the full potential requires a underlying structure that is not quite there. So businesses today basically are in some sense getting too much for policymakers and also getting too little. So let me try to explain that. In the too much category, businesses are now caught in the middle of many foreign policy and other geopolitical issues. Every major company in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere now requires the sort of geopolitical insight that used to be the domain only of oil and gas companies that were operating in complex environments. Now, pretty much every company needs that kind of capability. That's great for Lazard because we provide that kind of insight, but it's probably not so great for productivity because fundamentally you can't make an important business decision today without taking geopolitics fully into account, and that is different than 2 or 3 decades ago. During the Cold War, tension with Russia did not have any significant business impact because Russia was not that important to the global economy. That's not true with regard to where the geopolitical fractions are, or fractures are today. On the too little side, policymakers have not really fully stepped up to many of the core challenges that have already been identified, and the result of that is that companies are being asked to fill the void on social and other issues that policy hasn't fully fulfilled. So that is never going to end that well. That is a very, very, very imperfect third or fourth best relative to the structure that policymakers can put forward. So this is on everything from purely social issues to even the energy transition. I think there's been a lot of happy talk about what's involved in the energy transition. It is going to be expensive and it is going to be hard. Reasonable estimates are something like 10% of GDP per year through the next several decades invested in new sources of energy. And that's before you fully take into account the impact of artificial intelligence, at least given current chip design. Maybe the chips will change, but given current chip design on additional demand for electricity. That is a very, very tall bill, and the thought that companies are going to be meeting the vast bulk of that bill is unrealistic. So there's both too much and too little, but I want to end again on a note of optimism because it's a very propitious time for a lot of these technologies. Let's just try to capture them as best as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a short follow-up question because we are all curious about the U.S. economy. The U.S. is still 25% of the global GDP, with 5% of the global population. And there was expectations for a recession in the U.S. Then there was soft landing, but now it seems like there is no landing, and there's also speculations that Fed even have to increase interest rate when we're expecting a decrease in the interest rate in the summer. So we see that the inflationary pressure is still there. So there are different ways of looking at this. We saw that JP Morgan is worried that there will be a very rough landing. What kind of landing will there be in the U.S. economy if there is going to be a landing?
Sure, I'll answer that question and then I'll say I think it's probably partially the wrong question, but let me answer it first. My view, I'm pretty optimistic on this. I think the U.S. economy has weathered the past several years extremely well. The consumer is still relatively strong. The labor market is strong. I mentioned that productivity has picked up. That means that unit labor cost growth is also contained. Those are all really good things inflation. My own view is I think there's a temporary hiccup, just like there was at about this time last year, where inflation went sideways instead of continuing its downward path. I'm optimistic that the downward path will resume, so time will tell, and some humility is warranted because there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think the most likely path is one in which inflation continues to come down. But there are underlying problems in the U.S. And I would highlight the fiscal trajectory, where the deficit over the next 2 decades is projected to be 6 to 7% of GDP, and then polarization. The country is incredibly polarized. We obviously have an election coming up, and it is, I mean, as an example, I was confirmed as President Obama's budget director 15 years ago. At my confirmation hearing, Paul Ryan introduced me, and the Senate vote was 100 to 0. That would never happen today, and that was only 15 years ago. So in a very polarized environment, presidential elections are going to be very close. This will probably be determined by 1 million or 1.5 million people. And secondly, it's very hard to get serious policy done unless you control the White House, the House, and the Senate, and that only happens very infrequently.
So I think the question we're left with: how can such a dysfunctional political system deliver that kind of economic growth? But I see the managing director is asking for the floor, and you will, of course, madam, get the floor. I have the challenge that we now have 10 minutes left. It means that each of the excellencies have 2 minutes. Of course, it's hard to ask excellencies like you guys to to land, but I would love to hear you, but then do a 2 minute. But Kristalina, I'll come back to you, but I come to you now. But I think there is a good segue here because the global debt situation you have raised. We are close to 100% of GDP in global debt. And you are also saying we have to be more fiscally minded, but hope to be that without going into austerity that will then kill growth again. I think we have like the highest debt level now since the Napoleonic Wars. That's not good news, is it?
Not at all. So what is necessary? First, to differentiate. There are countries that can carry the debt and it is not a danger to them unless, however, they are mindful it may become a danger. And you mentioned the United States, deficit is high, there has to be thinking about fiscal path that brings it down. But there are countries where the debt burden is already far too high. And in these countries, we do need to offer a helping hand with that restructuring. There is the common framework that Saudi Arabia launched during their G20 presidency. It is slowly delivering, and we need to make it so that it delivers faster. I want to, however, I want to make on the issue of that 2 points. Number one, how is that we can deal with it more sustainably? Of course, by having growth going up. We looked at the measures in the hands of policymakers. If we were to re-energize trade, if we were to get a flow of capital to go where capital would bring highest returns, and if we were to build even stronger governance within this decade, we can get 1.2% higher growth. In other words, we get to what we had historically. So that whole issue about fragmentation in the world economy is really serious. Trade and financial flows are the transmission lines of prosperity, and it would be a huge mistake to lose them. So focus on that. And my second point is taking from the president of Nigeria, reforms that are mindful of the vulnerable people in society.
China and the U.S. And this is also a relationship that is
independent state through an international conference, and this is what we have been repeatedly requesting since the 7th of October. But what happened since the 7th of October, as you may very well know, where more than 200 days have passed, and Israel took advantage of that attack to retaliate disproportionately against the people of Gaza under the pretext that it wants to take revenge of Hamas. But in fact, what it is doing, it is taking a revenge from the Palestinian people as a whole. It is killing civilians, Palestinian civilians. This is what's been happening for 200 days. In figures, let me tell you, Israel has killed 34,000 people in 200 days from Gaza, most of whom are children, women, and older persons. It has wounded 75,000 people from among Gaza civilians, which means that the total victims since 7th of October in Palestine was 110,000 people, of both people who are killed and who are wounded. And we add to this that it has destroyed 75% of the whole Gaza Strip, 75% of institutions, buildings, roads, mosques, churches, etc. Gaza has become completely destroyed. 75% is not to be taken lightly. Borrell said before a few days ago that what is happening in Gaza has never happened, not even in the Second World War in Germany. Others have confirmed and have acknowledged that what is happening today in Gaza and in the West Bank has exceeded what took place in the Second World War in Germany and in other European countries. So the situation, ladies and gentlemen, in Gaza is unfortunate. We have been, since the beginning, calling for a ceasefire and for the people of Gaza to be able to access humanitarian aid. And we must be warned from the displacement and the migration of 2.2 million Palestinians from their homes and from Palestine. This will mean that we are facing a new Palestinian Nakba. Allow me to tell you at the end that what is happening in Gaza and what will happen in the next few days and what will Israel do in the next few days is the invasion of the city of Rafah, because all the Palestinians of Gaza have gathered in Rafah. Only a small strike is all it takes to force everyone to leave Palestine, and we will be witnessing the greatest catastrophe in the history of the Palestinian people. We ask Israel to stop its attack. We call upon especially the United States of America to request Israel to hold its fire, to cease its fire, because the United States is the only country that can prevent Israel from perpetrating that crime. This is what is happening in Gaza. And what are we asking for? We are asking the world these three things I have mentioned to you. And as long as the world has acknowledged Palestine as an independent state with observer status in the United Nations in 2011 to consider it a full member of the United Nations, and thus to acknowledge the state of Palestine. And I call upon all countries to acknowledge the state of Palestine as it acknowledged the state of Israel. These two countries are subject to one Security Council resolution, but the world acknowledged the state of Israel, but not the state of Palestine. We ask the world to commit to its obligations and acknowledge the state of Palestine. And after acknowledging the state of Palestine, only then can we sit down with Israel and negotiate on the borders. And only then can everyone enjoy full peace. This is our right as Palestinians, to have the right to self-determination, to have the right of our own state, similarly to all peoples of the world. This is, in brief, all what we are asking for, and this is the situation in Gaza. And, of course, what is happening in the West Bank. And what I fear, after Israel finishes with Gaza, it will turn to the West Bank to deport its people towards Jordan. Both Egypt and Jordan refused the deportation of the Palestinians from Palestine to their countries. But Israel needs someone to force it to stop, to convince Israel that this is unacceptable, and the only country in the world that can do that and which we hold responsible is the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to you, President Abbas. We also have the key foreign ministers from the region and also from the G7 here in the coming days discussing other ways of breaking the current impasse. And thank you, President Abbas, for coming. And also a big thank you to this great panel that we were so privileged to gather here. It was very enlightening, and I think everyone really appreciated that as our opening plenary at our special meeting here in Saudi Arabia. Give the panel another applause. Thank you.
Oak Studio, Season 15.
To go ahead and build another variant. I'm going to show you right now how we can go ahead and see that. So if we